Go ahead and get started. Everybody, thank you for joining us to this uh, penultimate session here on the interdisciplinary conference that we're doing here at Weatherford. We appreciate you joining us. This is our third year, I think, to do the conference, and first time to do it virtually. So far has been a really great success, and we appreciate you joining us for these afternoon sessions. Just a couple of notes here. We are, I'm going to turn this over to Crystal here in just a minute, but if you've got a question, just click down there on the Q&A and put your questions there. I'm going to ask that you put your questions there rather than in the chat box, and that'll streamline them all in one place for our presenters to kind of access. The chat box is a place you can interact with each other if you want to, but the Q&A is where I want you to put your questions. And just to remind you, I'm sure you guys have done more of these today, but we cannot see or hear you, so you guys are fine to watch this in your pajamas if you want to, right? Nobody can see it. It's all good. All right, so without further ado, let me introduce to you Crystal Woerly. Crystal is the Director of Public Relations here at Weatherford. Does an excellent job at that, if I do say so. And she is presenting with some others here her paper, Applying Freedom of Speech to Social Media Communications. Crystal?
Yes, thank you. I have with me today Randy Keck and Phil Riddle. Randy, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me start that just so I don't get off topic. Okay, well, maybe I am, or maybe I'm not. All right, so Randy is the owner and publisher of the Community News in Aledo, now Parker County's largest paid circulation newspaper. Randy is a past president of the Texas Press Association and serves on the board of directors of the National Newspaper Association Foundation. He also serves on the board of the Aledo Economic Development Corporation and the East Parker County Library. Phil Riddle is a 30-year veteran of journalism and a former coworker of mine. He mostly worked in community news. He was the managing editor of the Weatherford Democrat for 5 years, as well as being a freelance journalist, writing mostly for magazines and newspapers in the immediate Parker County area for another decade. He currently serves in a media relations position with Tarleton State University and works on the school's Fort Worth campus. So I'm having issues getting my screen to share, but that's okay. It was just so you didn't have to look at us the whole time, but I guess you get to look at us the whole time.
Crystal, so that may, if you have a split monitors, that could be part of it.
It might be. It's wanting me to change some permission settings.
Yeah, so that's probably what it is.
It's not required, so I'm not going to worry about it. So the First Amendment of the United States, I think we're all familiar with that, but specifically I want to look at the first word where it says Congress. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So we have to remember that when we're talking about freedom of speech. It was crafted to keep the government from restricting our free speech, except when it doesn't. The First Amendment does not apply to things like child pornography, copyright protection, or serious threats of violence. And it does not apply to private companies like Facebook or Twitter. And we'll dive into that deeper in a moment. But first, I want to look at how the First Amendment applies to the traditional role of journalism. So that's where Phil and Randy come in. I'd like you guys to share how has your experience in print journalism affected your understanding of our First Amendment right to freedom of speech? Who would like to tackle that?
You want me to start?
Go for it.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that before I got into journalism, I really never pondered the First Amendment. I mean, I don't think a lot of people do. But my experience as a publisher of a newspaper has solidified in my mind the foundational importance of the First Amendment to the other freedoms that we enjoy. I don't think that we would have a lot of the other freedoms we have without being able to express ourselves under the First Amendment and having the right to share our opinions and having the right to advocate for change. And so yes, the First Amendment has should give everyone a voice, and through newspapers, that is not only for the newspaper itself, but letters to the editor and other venues through which different points of view and different opinions can be explored.
I think Randy hit the nail right on the head when he used the word foundational. I think that's an incredibly accurate explanation of the freedom of speech. One of the things, it's really easy to talk about, and really easy to pretty easy to understand about freedom of speech. It's the government can't tell us what to say, but what we have to remember as journalists is while we have the right to say just almost anything that we want to say, there's a responsibility that goes along with that, and that's kind of an unspoken part of that that journalists, that we as journalists have to take into consideration before we put anything out there.
I have one other, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Randy.
Well, I have one other quick addition to that, and it's something to riff off of what Phil said, which is that several years ago, we had the privilege of hosting several journalists from the Middle East, actually in Willow Park. And so we all got in a room and everybody spoke different languages. So they had an interpreter and everybody had earsets so that we could hear, understand what each other was saying. But the one thing that just blew their minds was that we don't have anybody telling us what to write. We don't have a government entity or anybody that tells us what we can and can't say. And I just realized how unique that is compared to a lot of other places in the world.
Right. So I know during my time as a journalist that there were several instances where people misunderstood how the First Amendment applied to us. Do y'all have any examples of times? I can think of one or several, actually. I'll just put this out there. Car accidents, going out to take pictures at breaking news, and people thought that that I wasn't allowed to photograph them without their permission, and I'd have to explain how they were in a public space and I could take a picture because I was protected by that First Amendment. So do y'all have any other examples of when people have misunderstood how the First Amendment applies to journalists?
I think you hit the nail right on the head. The people want you to have freedom of speech as long as you're saying things that they want you to say. But as in my experience, it was always political beliefs or law enforcement actions, whether it was a crime that was committed and they didn't want their son's name or their daughter's name in the newspaper, or they were in an accident and they felt like you had to have some kind of a prior accessibility to the families to be able to say things that they might not really want to put out there.
Mm-hmm.
I also think there's another aspect of that some people misunderstand, that I'm not obligated to let them express their opinion through my newspaper. I've had some people who have submitted a letter to the editor, and as an editor, you have to decide whether this is something you want to print or not. You have to decide that, is it true? Is it respectful? We have various criteria we use for printing letters to the editor, and there have been times I've rejected a letter and people have told me I don't have the right to reject it, and I do, because it's my newspaper. And so again, as Crystal said earlier, it's Congress that can't tell people what they can and can't say.
That's a great segue into my next question, or the next topic is, people don't have a right to express themselves in Randy's newspaper, just like we don't have a right and an explicit right to express ourselves on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, or Snapchat. These forms of, so I was going to talk about also the forms of speech. We think mainly about verbal or written, but anything that is type of communication is protected by freedom of speech. I mentioned photography, videos that we put out there, pieces of art, those are all protected, but the channel that we put that on is not. So that channel being the local paper or a social media platform. So when we even create a profile on Facebook, we agree to their terms of use, which if you read it, restricts our freedom of speech. And social media sites have to regulate themselves in some way. If you had a social media site that was just said, you can post whatever you want, whenever you want, immediately they're going to be overrun with spam and all their users are just going to leave. So content moderation is always going to exist on social media. So shifting from the newspaper to social media, what's the biggest misunderstanding of freedom of speech, in your opinion, as it applies to our social media channels?
I'll kick off that. I believe that I believe that people probably misunderstand on social media the aspect of freedom of speech from the standpoint of, with freedom comes responsibility. And just because you have the freedom to say what you want to say, you know, there's a famous Supreme Court case that, you know, no right is absolute. And I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, but don't hold me to that. But, you know, he said, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. And I think there are a lot of things on social media where that's exactly, in a sense, what's happening. Is people are saying and doing things that might tend to incite other people to take negative action. And so while there's nothing technically that prevents people from saying and doing that, I feel like they're not exercising appropriate responsibility by doing it.
Right.
It goes back to the point that Randy made a little while ago about, you know, he gets to decide which letter to the editor run on the paper because it's his paper. And it goes to the same thing with the owners of these platforms. They're basically privately held companies, and they can make those rules. Now, whether anybody avails themselves of the right to look through all of those rules, you know, that they probably don't. Right. But those rules are still in place, and they're in place to create a situation where people can come on and exchange ideas without anyone being the singular idea. And bullying other people, things like, you know, there's all kinds of reasons to have these rules, but they all come down to the fact that it's somebody's business, and they get to decide. This doesn't really run into the First Amendment, because the First Amendment keeps the Congress from telling us what to say.
Right. Yeah, so I have a quote, and when I was younger, really resonated with me, but my understanding of it's changed over the years. And it's I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And then as I got older and realized, you know, you can't shout fire in a theater, that would also include the ability to put out, like I mentioned earlier, child pornography, all these things that's like, I think that might cross the line. And even though you can say these things, it doesn't mean you're not going to receive the consequences of it. And the growth of social media has just really made me examine that even closer, to look at where that line is now and what isn't and isn't applicable. Like we look at the mob retaliation. So the pickets they had in Charleston several years ago, there was a guy who was, they had pictures of him, and the mob went online and they thought they had identified who he was, and they got the wrong person, but they started sending death threats to this man and his family, and he wasn't even at this rally. And so now his life is in danger. So we have this mob retaliation on social media, fake news, all these types of things. So where does misinformation or write out lies fall under freedom of speech, especially on social media?
Wow, that's a tough one. They still have the right to say it. That's where the responsibility takes over. And from a journalism standpoint, it also, you're kind of counting on an educated audience to kind of think about what this stuff is. Think about, don't just get all of your information from one source. Think about what's being said, what the source is, and how believable it is. I can't stress enough that being an educated news consumer, journalism consumer, will oversee a whole lot of this stuff in itself. There are so many people that go on these sites looking for agreement to their own particular views, and you will find it. You will absolutely find it. But that doesn't mean that it's a truth, or that it's an honest depiction of what they're trying to say.
I'll say that there's a difference in the arena, perhaps, that those of us, which you'd call more traditional media, newspapers, radio, television, operate in, as opposed to social media. Something a lot of people don't understand is that as the publisher of a newspaper, I can get sued for anything that's printed in the newspaper. Of course, anybody can sue anybody for anything, but I can lose a lawsuit if there is something in my paper that defames another person, or, makes a false accusation, or, calls somebody a criminal when they're not a criminal, or whatever. And every word that my staff writes, every word that's in every advertisement, every word that's in a letter to the editor, I'm responsible for, because I can get sued for false defamatory information. And we've seen that somewhat recently with the voting machine companies who have sued media outlets who propagated false reports of, misuse of voting machines, which it didn't happen, and yet they reported it as fact. And there are now multi-billion-dollar lawsuits against those outlets. There don't seem to be those same constraints on social media companies, and that's something that tends to bother me.
Or those who are acting as citizen journalists. You have a lot of people who have decided to pick up their typewriter, as it is, and call themselves a journalist without understanding what libel is, what slander is, how to vet their information. What's the difference in responsibility in the words written in a news article or posted, say, to the Community News's website or Facebook page versus what's posted by an individual in the comment section or even on their own page? Like, how does that carry different weight on social media?
I would say for us that because of our Facebook page is associated with our newspaper, and because we consider our website as an extension of the newspaper, that we continue to operate under the same constraints. I try to allow as free wheeling comments as I can, but especially during COVID, we had some people making comments that were just blatantly false. And so I removed the comments and let them know why, because I don't want my newspaper in any way to be associated with false information, whether it's written by me or written by a member of the public on a comment.
It's really difficult to hold the same standards for a reporter for the New York Times or the Washington Post or any newspaper to someone that's posting with 60 followers. It's a hard thing to hold them to that same. But what you have to understand is that 60 followers will exponentially blossom when things get out there. So it's the same responsibility needs to be held by everyone. But the fact is, everyone's not educated to the realization of what could happen, the results of whatever they say on there, and that can be problematic for sure.
Right. Well, there is talk by some politicians to stop social media platforms from regulating the speech and trying to declare these arenas as a public forum. Earlier this month, in fact, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas started another round of debate on this. He is bluntly not a fan of social media. He believes that social media should be considered a public space, and he wants it to be viewed as a public utility like the telephone company. So like when you're on the telephone company's not regulating what you're saying to the person you're communicating with. They're a neutral party. But but we pay, my thoughts on that is we pay to use the telephone. We don't pay for Facebook or Twitter or other social media platforms. And then on the flip side, we have platforms historically like television and radio that are regulated by the FCC. So there's a gray area there. Where does social media fit in this puzzle? Is it a public utility? And even if it was declared a public utility, would that release it from its ability to regulate the speech that's on the platform?
As much as I really dislike things that I see happening on social media, I don't think that the government should come in and tell people what they can and can't say. I think that is cutting some dangerous water. That being said, and I have to apologize because I didn't have the opportunity to research this, so I'm telling you what I think I know, which is that social media companies are exempted in many ways from the responsibilities that we have. And I feel like on the one side, don't constrain them from having people say what they want to say, but on the other side, make them responsible for what is said and open them up to being able to be sued for libel and slander, because right now it's just kind of a Wild West situation where people say whatever they want to say without consequence. And whereas when Phil was an editor and what he does and what I do is we're human beings, and we look at those words that come in and we decide whether they should be propagated or not. Facebook and other platforms use algorithms that may or may not be successful in filtering out those kinds of things. And so, you know, these people make a whole lot of money and they can afford to hire some people to review posts, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah, I was reading about that earlier today, that the social media companies are protected. I didn't write down the federal law, but they cannot be held liable for actions taken by its users who post, you know, say they post like, we're going to go riot at this place at this time, and someone gets hurt. You can't hold the social media platform liable for that. But if you were to run an editorial or even an ad in your newspaper, I bet you would be held responsible. Yeah.
Absolutely.
To make for the politicians to get the ones that want to do this, and I'm sure that there at some point every one of them has wanted to make this a little bit more regulated. For them to do that, it's going to take some legislative changes, because at this point in time, these are private businesses that are unregulated. So they're not going to be able to just stamp their feet and shake some fairy dust out there and make this happen. It's going to take some legislative issues, and there's going to have to be sort of a come to Jesus meeting between the parties to make this go away. And I can't see that would happen, because generally the ones that hate it are offset by the ones on the other side that love it, because the message is theirs. And so I don't know that there's anything that's being done in the name of fairness. It's all being done in the name of partisanship.
Yeah.
It's really tricky, because you don't want to put people, you don't want to prevent freedom of speech, but you also have to have something that accounts for the responsibility that truthful information and credible information is being shared. And I think Facebook and some other platforms have kind of become the back fence multiplied by millions, and that's just unfortunately we have I think everybody attributes this to Mark Twain. I don't know if it was him or not, that a lie can make its way all the way around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. So it's a difficult situation.
So what about the responsibility these companies have to, I guess, their shareholders, in a way that they uphold their rules and regulations? So we have the mass exodus a few months ago I think it was a short-lived mass exodus from Facebook to Parler, and then Amazon, which was hosting that platform, said, there's a lot of hate speech happening on your platform. We're not going to host you anymore. And then a lot of people in the public got upset at Amazon, like they were thinking they were obligated to host this forum where they could exercise their free speech. So I'm just thinking, like, how did we get to this point where we as a society feel that we're so entitled to these public forums that we can demand private companies to host them for us? I'm just fly now.
Go ahead, Phil.
It's just a matter of people wanting to make sure that they're heard, and this was an opportunity for them to be heard, and it's frustrating when that doesn't happen anymore. It's a difficult situation for them, but it goes directly back to the fact that this is a business, and if it's a bad business, they're not going to stay in it. They owe their shareholders profits. That's what they're beholden to the shareholders for. And as much as we want it to be for the good of the country and for the good of humankind, it boils down to, when you're dealing with a situation like that, it's for profits, and they're going to make the best business decision that they can make.
And I'll go back to what Phil said earlier, is that they're a private company and they do whatever they want to do.
Right.
So if they decide they don't want to host it, they don't have to host it.
So, every time people get upset with Facebook, someone comes up with a new platform and it's short-lived, and then people go back to Facebook or go back to Twitter. So Facebook and Twitter, in a way, almost have a monopoly on a lot of our social media when it comes to the written form of social media, not just the strictly visual forms. Is there a point when these platforms lose their right to constrict the constitutionality of freedom of speech, like where they can't do that anymore because they in fact do become a public forum just because no one else can compete with them?
I do think with platforms like Facebook, it's almost monopolistic, and I'll be real honest. I'm not a big fan. I mean, I use Facebook. I'm not a big fan, but things don't work the way they used to in the news business, and it just makes me want to pull I'm losing hairline here, but it makes me want to pull more of it out when people that we used to talk to on a regular basis for news sources now say, oh, just go look at our Facebook page, and it's no longer we're kind of, in a sense, losing our exclusivity status on a lot of information, and yet we are also the ones who vet the information. So it's tough, but I do think Facebook, to a degree, bears a responsibility to say you can't use hate speech, you can't slander people, you can't incite people to violence. I feel like that's actually almost essential and not something that should even be questioned. But whether the government should force them to do that, that's tough to say. But somebody should bear responsibility.
That's a really good point. The FCC handles it with broadcast, and I truly believe that at some point there will be someone that handles the social media as far as governmental regulation goes. I do think regulations will be enacted. The issue is, as fast as technology is changing, we don't know how long these are even going to be problems, because we don't know what the next big thing is going to be and what problems those are going to bring. So that's what creates the need for this agency to kind of overview everything.
Well, I don't know if social media is a fad. I said back in 2002, 2003, when my college friends were all using Oh,
MySpace?
no, LiveJournal. It was before MySpace. But after Friendster was first in the 90s. They were using LiveJournal, and I thought they were ridiculous, and this was never going to last. And now, for the past 10 years, the bulk of my job has been social media. So I don't think it's going away.
I don't think it's a fad. I absolutely don't think
Yeah.
it's a fad, but I think there will be additional areas to go because it was Facebook for a long time, and then Twitter, and then everybody else sneaks in there. There's Instagram, and everything is there. And I'm just saying there will be additions to it that'll
Right.
create new standards and new issues.
Right. You know, some people look at the social media and the way it's developed with its algorithms and its AI, almost like it's become Big Brother. It's looking for these keywords, or almost people will call it, you know, thought crime, for anyone who's a fan of that book. I am. Is there a point when those algorithms and what they look for and the censorship could become Big Brother, or in some ways are we already there with social media?
I'll start this one. I think we're pretty close. You can have a conversation with your significant other about it's time to go and buy, you know, shrubs for the front yard, and you sit down and look at your phone, and there's an ad on there for Lowe's, and they're having a sale on shrubs. So I don't think it's that far away. I don't think it's Big Brother to that extent yet. I don't think it's you know, there's someone that's wanting to convert us to just coverage of that sort. But I do think that there's an aspect of it that's very, very Big Brotherish.
Yeah.
I'll agree. It as Phil said, it may not be Big Brother. I still find it kind of creepy. There's a seminar I went to a while back, and this guy was talking about that, you know, they say that your Alexa's not listening in on you, and so he decided he would try it, and he just turned to his wife and he said, you know, I haven't been scuba diving in a while. I think I need to look for some scuba diving. He's never did scuba diving in his life, but he said, I think I need to look for some scuba diving equipment. And sure enough, when he got online, there were the ads coming up for scuba diving equipment. So
I have the scariest example of that. A few years ago, I was talking with my husband in the living room in the front of the house. His phone was in the room with us. My phone was on the opposite side of the house. And I was talking to him about a potential health issue with one of our children. I had never Googled this issue or anything. I went and get my phone, and I got almost immediately a Facebook ad about a study for children with this particular situation. And I was like, I didn't even say that near my phone. I said it near my husband's phone, but Facebook knows we're married.
mm-hmm.
And so I got the ad. Yeah, that was interesting.
Well, you know, and there's an interesting battle going on right now between Facebook and Apple. You know, Apple is now wanting on its apps for you to be able to decide what parts of your information is okay with you to be shared. And Facebook doesn't like that. And I'm kind of pulling for Apple in this one. I think that you should be the one who decides how your information gets shared.
Right.
You had mentioned a little while ago about regulations, and I think this is where the regulations are going to start, is with the companies that are creating the technology, because Apple doesn't, they want to be able to tout that as being a feature of their device. Like, you can buy this phone right here, and we're not going to be able to keep up with you. We're not going to. You have the opportunity to decide what you want to share. You get this other guy's phone, and you know they track you just like they are now. So I think that the regulation may come as an industry situation.
Well, going back to when you created that profile and you agreed to their terms, it's probably in there somewhere that we're collecting this information on you, and we will use it to send you ads. And at the same time, we're going to regulate what you can and can't post or say. So yeah, there seems to be a bit of an imbalance between the platforms being able to collect data on you, and at the same time being able to regulate what you can put out there into that social media world, even to the point to where they can come in and shut you down. You know, they've shut down a lot of loud people on social media. Most recently, our former president, Donald Trump, was taken off of pretty much all of the platforms because of him tweeting as he tweets or did tweet. What are your thoughts on that whole situation from a journalism standpoint?
I'll jump in, and I don't want to jump into whether or not Donald Trump should be on Twitter, but I will say that again, it's a private company and they can decide who can post tweets on their platform. And I've had people that I have said, you can't send me letters to the editor anymore. It doesn't happen. It's like in 26 years, maybe on a couple, but there are people out there who just thrive on posting or saying things that are provably false. And so if you don't want to be associated with falsehoods and propaganda, then you have to make a stand somewhere.
But that's my answer as well. It's somebody else's business, but for them to take care of the business, they make those decisions. If people are offering up tweets or posts that are just outlandish and are I can't think of really an adjective that's not going to put me on one side or the other, so I won't say anything. They get to decide.
Yeah.
They get to decide for themselves, and I just don't see that can be any other way.
I will say with Twitter that I think the horse is already out of the barn, so I'm not sure why they even bothered.
Right, that's true. So given everything that we've discussed in the past 30 minutes, where do you think the future of freedom of speech is headed on social media?
I think there may be a difference of where I want to see it headed and where it's going to be headed, but I do think, kind of like Phil said, that radio stations, television stations are regulated by the FCC, and the internet is kind of a hybrid. It's a kind of print, kind of broadcast situation, but I could see where that, but radio and television stations don't have these situations where just anybody can pop in and broadcast their message too. So that's the whole new thing with social media. Well, it's not that new anymore, but that's the whole thing, is that just almost anybody can be a publisher now. And that's where, The Death of Expertise, there's a book on that there's anybody, as y'all talked about earlier, anybody can be a publisher, anybody can say, follow my blog without in any way having credentials where they learn to distinguish between what's real and what's false and what can and shouldn't be said.
It may sound cynical, though, what I'm about to say, but social media there is so much money, so much power, and so much political influence that's involved in social media that it is a situation now that has driven itself into a corner where so many people have, and I don't want to say abused because it's the First Amendment, they can say what they want to say, but they have pushed it to such limits that it's hard to imagine a future without some kind of regulation, some kind of government agency oversight.
Well, there are currently no questions in the Q&A. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Now is the time to put those in. I think we're kind of wrapping it up. I want to thank Phil and Randy for joining me today. And I know I've had good conversations over the years with both of these gentlemen about topics related to journalism. So it's nice to have them both together to have a conversation all as a group. And thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to hear what we have to say.
Thanks for including us, Crystal.
Right. Well, then, if there is no questions, then we can go ahead and wrap. wrap it up here. Crystal, thank you for hosting this interesting discussion. And to all the attendees, thank you for showing up. We appreciate it. The next session will start here at 2 o'clock. So.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you.
Too. Bye.